So my name is Simon McHenry. I'm an attorney here at Wells Call Injury Attorneys. I work in Fairfield, California, and I graduated from BYU Law School back in 2021.
So, did you go right to law school right out of BYU, Idaho?
So yeah, I did. Yeah, I graduated from BYU Idaho. I think it was in 2018, right to law school.
So, you probably, when you were here at BYU, Idaho, heard me tell students that they shouldn't be lawyers. What advice would you give to aspiring law students other than don't become a lawyer?
Um, I feel like a lot of lawyers that I talk to said the same exact thing to me. I think we're all a little prideful. So we all ignore all that advice. But the thing is I would just recommend that you do a lot of research as to what you want to do. I think the reason why a lot of people say don't become a lawyer is because it can be, if you're not careful, it can be a very time intensive, very high stress environment. But I think something that you need to do as you're learning to become a lawyer, if you're thinking about becoming a lawyer, is be proactive about researching what are some careers where I can, have some type of work-life balance. And that was something that was really big for me. Before I even went to law school, I started just kind of talking to other lawyers. And it wasn't all doom and gloom like everybody says it is. There's of course some lawyers that, they work in New York City or they work in, big laws, what we call it. And sure, that does sound like terrible stuff there. And there really isn't any balance there. There's not all law is like that.
Some students feel like they need to know what kind of law they're going to practice before they head to law school. What do you think about that?
I don't think you necessarily need to know what type of law you're going to practice because the thing is when you go to law school, they train you as a generalist. So you have to learn everything anyways. So it's not like you can just sit down and say, like an undergrad, this is my major, this is all I ever want to focus on. Everything else is just a bunch of garbage. You can't do that. And you have to learn about the other concepts. And it really helps you become a well-rounded lawyer. But yeah, I think that you don't need to exactly know, but I would recommend that, after during your first year of law school, you should really be thinking about it, what type of lawyer you want to be. I knew in my first year of law school I wanted to be a government attorney, and that's what I did. I was actually a district attorney for 3 years before I transitioned into private practice. But because I knew I wanted to do that, it made it a lot easier for me to define my path and not have to worry about, okay, well, how am I gonna have a job after law school? And so the sooner you define that path for yourself and you figure out what you want to do, the easier it will be to graduate from law school and not be kind of just twiddling with your thumbs and thinking, what am I gonna do with my life? And I don't have a job, right? So I think defining what you want to do early on is good, but there's not any pressure before law school necessarily to do that. But I think once you hit the ground running your first year of law school, that should definitely be something that you should know, which is kind of crazy. You should know probably before your first exams. You should kind of have an idea of what you want to do. And the way that I kind of figured that out is I cold called a lot of alumni and just like, hey, what do you do? I want to know, what's your life like? And the consensus after cold calling a lot of different people was I wanna be a government attorney.
So, to that end, like, because it doesn't really matter what you do your undergraduate degree in, is there value in doing political science over some other kind of thing you might do if you want to be a lawyer?
Yeah, I think there is value to doing political science. Most people in law school will have taken that route, and I think it provides a nice foundation for a lot of the concepts that you learn in your first year of law school, especially constitutional law. And so you can study just about anything. I tell everybody that because, I think about the guy that was top of my class, he studied guitar at Texas Tech, And so nobody would have expected that guy to be, just the stellar attorney. He is. But the thing about it is, I think that a lot of the concepts that you learn in your first year of law school will seem foreign to you if you're not a poli sci major or you haven't dealt with those particular, issues. Just because a lot of poli sci does deal with a lot of legal concepts.
So there's a number of students at BYU Idaho that take the LSAT, and let's say they score in the 150 to 153 range. Um, that probably puts them out of the running for a place like BYU Law or some of the upper tier law schools. What would you advise someone in that situation to do about law school?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I actually was an admissions counselor at BYU Law while I was there. And, if you've got a low LSAT score, then you better have a high GPA. If you got a low GPA, you better have a high LSAT score. Those are what we call clippers, right? And so the thing is that, each school is looking to bump up those stats because the stats are directly connected to their rankings within the U.S. News ranking report, right? Which a lot of people take really seriously, but at the end of the day, nobody really cares about it once you graduate law school, unless you're planning to become a Supreme Court justice one day, which most people aren't. So, but yeah, I just don't think that all that really matters in the grand scheme of things.
So there are some law schools that'll give you like a scholarship with a 150 LSAT score. Should students be like leery of going to a school like that?
I'd be careful. So LSAT scores, I don't know, I've got a beef to pick with LSAT.
That's fine.
So I just think that LSAT scores are really dumb. A lot of people put a lot of weight in them, but you have people that will have high LSAT scores and they're terrible lawyers and they're terrible law students. And you have people that have low LSAT scores and become great lawyers. It's not really indicative much of anything. But yeah, if a school is offering you a scholarship with your 150 LSAT, it's not necessarily bad. What I would warn you to do is look at the conditions of that scholarship and you need to really know yourself. I'll give you an example. So my wife, Maddie, I don't know if you remember her, but she also went to law school. She actually just graduated from the University of the Pacific, McGeorge School of Law out here in Sacramento. And when she was applying to law school, I mean, she had a great LSAT score. She could have gotten into basically any school, but she was kind of constrained because we have kids and we were trying to figure out how to balance all that. So she was looking for like a part-time program. And the McGeorge School of Law program, they basically said, "Hey, we'll give you, full ride scholarship, but the condition is you have to stay in the top 50% of your class." And so you think about, okay, well, what's top 50%? You start to do some of the research and you'll look on there and you'll be like, oh, top 50% is getting like a 3.1, right? And you think a 3.1 GPA, that's really easy. But the thing about it is that with law school, something you don't realize, I always tell everybody, it's like the academic Hunger Games. Really, you're all pitted against each other and you're all ranked against each other. And so everything is created on a curve, especially your first year. And so that 3.1 GPA or whatever, that might be, a really hard thing to actually achieve. And so sometimes people will start to think, well, I had a 4.0 in undergrad and I was doing so great. And it's like, well, no, the 4 doesn't necessarily translate because if you're not on that top 50% threshold, then you lose your scholarship, right? And all of a sudden you're paying 50 grand a year for law school. There's law schools that do that conditional scholarship type deal. And if you're willing to bet on yourself, then sure, go for it, right? And I think Maddie was very comfortable betting on herself because she did have a higher LSAT score. She did do really well in her undergrad. And she's never had issues with tests or anything like that. So she was just like, I'll bet on myself, and it paid off. She doesn't have any debt at all. So she went through all.
Are you serious?
Yeah. So yeah. So it's worth it if you are willing to do what it takes to stay in that top 50%. And it's a lot. She ended up graduating number 2 in her class,
Wow.
but it was like really intense for about 4.5 years.
Does it matter how your school is ranked when you're trying to get a job?
Depends what type of job you want. So if you're wanting to go into, big law, you want to go be like the guys in suits or something like that, um, you're going to want to be in a higher ranked school. So generally, those higher ranked schools are going to be producing more of those big law corporate attorneys. If you want to go work for like the federal government, go work in DC, big law can be the way to go. But the thing about it is that it's just a number. It's a ranking, right? So there's lots of guys that, that end up in big positions, big law positions that are from lower ranking schools. Because really, at the end of the day, it's all about your social skills, your social intelligence. It's kind of like not what you know, it's who you know, right? And so if you can kind of finagle your way into different circles, then it doesn't really matter where you went. The only thing is that with that ranking, it kind of gives you that upper hand right at the beginning, but that starts to fade as people start to see your record. So if
Yeah.
it doesn't show, then it doesn't matter.
Yeah, but I'm just thinking about what Maddie did, like free law school. That is, I've never heard of that law school before. Like, that could be a really awesome gig, right? Like, to have
Yeah.
no debt from law school.
Well, and her law school is what I would call like a regional powerhouse. So a lot of the elected DAs for the state of California went to McGeorge. So and they're known nationally as a trial law school. So basically they pump out just trial attorneys. So it like I said, it all kind of depends on what type of lawyer you want to be. So that could be something that you think about as you're applying to law schools. Well, if I want to be a big law attorney, then I need to make sure that I'm going to, like BYU is kind of an outlier. They're not in the top five, but they produce big law attorneys. Over half of my class is in big law, but that's a lot of it because it's just like connections through the church, right? But yeah, it depends on what you want to do. If you don't care as much about getting to that big law place, then you can get away with going to a lower ranked law school. And the best piece of advice I ever got before going to law school, when I was kind of weighing my options of where I was going to go, a judge told me, go to the best, cheapest law school you can go to. And so that's, I think that's the best piece of advice that I could give anybody.
That's great. So you went to BYU Law, you were on the admissions team there, or at least you worked in their office.
Mhm.
So many of my students want to know, how do I get into BYU Law? How do they do it, Simon?
There's not like a magic formula, man. It's so different. Right now, the LSAT, the GPA is just outrageous. I always tell everybody I would never get into BYU now. And I think that's true for a lot of prior classes before me. But I think getting into BYU Law, I think they're just trying to figure out what's your unique story, right? I think a lot of people put on a lot of weight on their GPA and that LSAT score. That's only two factors in the analysis, right? It's a whole person analysis. And so you really need to show them, is this person going to be an extraordinary person? Is this person going to basically bring some type of good reputation to our law school, right? That's really what they're looking for. It's like they're creating a legacy through their students. So I think that's probably the most important thing. So I would put a lot of more weight into personal statements, and making sure those are well written. Some people, they would put in their application and they'd have a stellar LSAT score and a stellar GPA. And then you're just kind of trying to figure out, well, what makes you different from, the other Joe Schmo that's got a stellar LSAT score and a stellar GPA? Well, it's really that personal statement that's really going to explain to them that you're more than just a number. You're a person, right? In my experience, I don't know if I should say this, but so I had a pretty low LSAT score, but I had a high GPA. And so knowing that, I was like, okay, well, I really need to crack it with this personal statement. And when I was an admissions counselor, I actually was on like the database. I was like, I wonder what they said about me. So I hopped on there and I look at it, and I don't know if I was allowed to do this, but whatever, it's gone. I've done it. And it was funny. On the first pass, they looked at the numbers and they're just like, oh, we don't think so, right? And then they start talking about my personal statement. And on the second pass, they're like, we want to set up an interview with them. Um, and then what happened was I interviewed with the missions counselor, and it was it was great, And actually, I was in Brussels at the time, interning for the State Department. And so what happened was, it's like the entire time, I don't even think we talked about law school at all. We just talked about Europe because she was just such a fanatic of just like European culture. And she was like, oh, I can't believe you're doing this for the State Department. And then after that, I got an acceptance letter, right? So I think it's just like really when you're one of those people that are like a clipper, like I said, high GPA or high LSAT score, it's going to come down to what separates you, what makes you unique, what makes you think that you're going to be a part of this legacy they want to create.
Should they be strategic in letters of recommendation, or like kind of guide people as to what kind of letters to write or look for certain kinds of people?
Yeah, I would be strategic in your letters recommendation. That's another thing I was pretty strategic in. I made sure that the letters that I asked for were with professors that I worked closely with or I did really well in their classes. I think you wrote me one. And,
Yeah, I did.
And so, and actually I got to read all of these letters, even though I'm not supposed to. But when I was a missions counselor, I was like, let me check it out. I wonder what they said about me. And so I think really the thing that you want to do is you want to make sure you do that. One of the big no-nos that I would say is don't get your attorney relative to write you a letter. Don't get some guy in your ward to write you a letter. Don't get a friend to write a letter. It's just like you really need to show that you have an independent neutral that is just saying, hey, I've got no skin in the game, but I know this person. I've worked with this person, and they are very deserving of every bit of your loss.
Awesome, Simon. I think that's all the questions I have. Any other like bits of wisdom or advice you'd give to students?
Yeah, I just reiterate, figure out early what type of life you want for yourself as far as work-life balance goes. It's really easy to get caught up in the rat race and to be working like crazy hours and forgetting what really matters in all of it. Like for me, like I went into prosecution and it was really fun, but I started to realize kind of like the toll it was taking on just like my work-life balance, and that's one of the more family flexible jobs is being a prosecutor. And so that's what kind of pushed me into going into injury law because there's just a lot more flexibility. So I think just knowing what type of life you want and then being intentional about building that life within your profession is going to be big because there's going to be people that are going to call on you in the middle of the night. There's going to be people that want you to do impossible tasks. Set your boundaries early so people know who you are. So then they don't get to think that they get to trample over you because you don't know who you are, right? So, um,
That's really good advice.
yeah.
Yeah, more and more, I think injury law is not a bad path to take.
Yeah, I think there's a big stigma of being the ambulance chaser. But you know what? And I was kind of apprehensive about switching over to injury law because of that stigma. But get over yourself, right? Get over yourself and just know that like, yeah, the money's good, the life is good. Why why wouldn't I, right? So
Yeah. There are a lot of organizations out there that, will have a reputation or they'll have some kind of prestige associated with them. And so they know that people are going to want to come work for them. And so then they treat you worse as an employee. They expect more from you than they should because they're like, but you should want our brand or our reputation attached to you. And there's a lot of value in just figuring out what you want out of life and finding a place that'll give it to you and then not even worrying about like what's the reputation or any of that stuff.
exactly. And I think a lot of people get caught up in that prestige junk, right? Like, and I definitely was, even as a prosecutor, I was like, I want to become the elected DA of Contra Costa County, right? And, you know, I, I started to see, well, what does that really mean for me and my family? And why do I really want that? Like, do I want that because I want people to, feel a certain way about me, or do I want that because that's, I don't know. I just think going back kind of like your purpose in life, your divine purpose, it's all about family. At the end of the day, like your coworkers are not going to remember all the long days that you took and all the long nights that you worked, but your kids and your wife are, right? And so at the end of the day, what matters is your family. So keep that in mind.